Hello again, everyone. So in December 2019, I managed to pass the JLPT N1 with a pretty good score. In this video, I'll share what I think is the best way to pass. This isn't really a step-by-step guide, but more rather the things I think are the most important to consider for anyone trying to pass. I want to preface this video by saying that just because you can pass the Japanese proficiency test, that doesn't necessarily mean you're proficient in Japanese overall. It simply means that you can read and understand formal Japanese fairly well. At the time I passed the N1, I could hardly string a sentence together, and my listening ability was questionable at best. So if you want to overall get better at understanding natural speech and improve your speaking, you won't find much value in this video. This is specifically for passing the JLPT. The most important thing. By far the most important factor is reading ability. If you want to pass N1, the absolute best and maybe even only way is to improve your reading comprehension. In this video, I'll explain why I think this, as well as suggest tips you can use to improve your reading. Why reading is the best way. Reason 1. The majority of the test is reading. So the JLPT can be divided roughly into 3 sections: vocabulary and grammar, reading, and listening. And while the reading section of the test is only worth 1/3 of the total marks, the vocab grammar section also makes up an extra 1/3. And here's the thing, your grammar and vocab depends upon your reading ability. In other words, if your reading is good, there's no way your grammar and vocab isn't good. If you can pass the reading section, you'll be able to pass the vocabulary grammar section, as most of the vocabulary and sentence structures in the vocabulary and grammar section is necessary to understand the reading section. That's why I managed to pass the vocabulary grammar section without studying any grammar for the test. Not only that, but improving your reading will immensely help with the listening section too. This is because if you listen to the recordings used in the test, the way they speak isn't natural spoken Japanese. It's more like formal written Japanese. Of course, you can't just ignore listening completely, and you'll still need to implement some listening into your immersion. But if your goal is solely to pass the JLPT, it's best to make reading your first priority. Reason 2. Reading will give you a deeper understanding of grammar than studying grammar ever will. When I was an English teacher overseas, there were many students who had an incredible knowledge of grammar and yet would constantly make mistakes when using even the most basic grammar. If I showed 2 sentences, one mistaken and one correct, they might be able to tell me which is correct, but only after some time and with much mental effort and deliberation. They're not able to feel at a glance which one is right. This is because the only way to get that sort of natural, intuitive understanding is a lot of input. That is, reading and listening. The more input you get, the more you'll see the same patterns over and over again. Eventually, you'll have seen those patterns so many times that you'll intuitively be able to recognize immediately whether the sentence is natural or not, and be able to distinguish subtle differences in meaning between sentences. Think about your native language. If your native language is English, when I say, "he wants to go now," you can probably recognize instantly it should be wants with an S and not want. You know this intuitively because you've seen the word he paired with wants so many times in a similar context that anything else feels unnatural. You didn't need to learn verb rules to know that this sounds unnatural. Could you imagine how inefficient it would be to use logic and conscious effort to work out that this sentence is mistaken? Developing intuition for grammar makes answering the test questions not only quicker, but it requires less effort and thought and leads to greater accuracy. Reason 3. It's enjoyable. There is no quick way to pass the N1. No matter how you do it, you will still need to put in hundreds, maybe thousands of hours to pass. So wouldn't you want those hours to be spent enjoyably? When you get to a certain reading level in Japanese, or any language, you get to a point where you can comfortably read about your interests. This makes the whole process infinitely more enjoyable. You start improving without even realizing. I personally never intended to pass the JLPT N1. I only took it because I wanted to study at a Japanese university, but I was able to pass with such a high score because of all the hours I'd willingly spent reading for pleasure. That said, there were some uncommon grammar structures I'd not seen before, which is why my mark in the vocabulary and grammar section was lower than the other sections. So going over the rarer and less seen grammar and vocab definitely doesn't hurt if you want to maximize your chance of passing. I'm not actually saying don't study at all for the test, only that you don't need to if you don't want to, and even if you do, it doesn't need to be more than a very small part of your overall time spent with a language. What to read with. When you're at the beginner or intermediate level, it doesn't matter too much what you read, as long as it's somewhat comprehensible and enjoyable. But at the advanced level, you have a better chance of passing the JLPT if you expand the subjects and topics you read about. Ideally, you want to focus on reading material that's formally written, uses standard written Japanese, and would be able to be understood by any educated native speaker. This means casual or spoken style writing, which you'll often find on social media and in comic books, probably won't be too helpful. On the other hand, esoteric reading material that uses overly technical language, think of academic papers and old literature, I wouldn't recommend that either. While it might be useful in terms of learning more complex grammar structure, a lot of the specialized vocabulary will be unnecessary for the test. The articles you'll have to read in the JLPT will feature some verbose language, but there won't be any highly specialized or technical language. It will only be text that any Japanese high school graduate would be able to understand without too much trouble. Of course, if you like to read the type of material I mentioned, don't stop, because reading any sort of material will help. I'm only talking about what's the most efficient if your primary goal is to pass the JLPT. So what is good to read? If you ask me, the best types of reading materials to read for the JLPT are books, both non-fiction and fiction, and online or magazine articles. In my experience, the writing style in these types of media generally resembles the text used in the JLPT more than other media. In fact, I think a lot of the text in the N1 are actually taken from real published articles. When it comes to what topics and subjects to read about, variety is key. It's good to read about a whole range of topics, as this will expose you to a wider range of vocabulary and phrases that could appear on the test. Before I took the test, I would read anything I could find about topics from psychology and history to films and current events. How should I read? Because this is a video about the N1, I'm going to assume you're not a complete beginner and have a reasonable knowledge of kanji and vocabulary. If you are a beginner, I'll probably make a video sometime down the line detailing ways to learn kanji and basic reading comprehension. Extensive versus intensive reading. Broadly speaking, there are two types of ways to read, intensively and extensively. Intensive reading entails slowly and carefully reading, making sure to consider every word and detail. Extensive reading is more like what you do in your native language. You glide through the text, retaining the main points, without getting caught up in all the little details. This is different to skimming. You're still focusing and reading every part, but think of reading a novel in your native language. There might be a word you're not familiar with, or a sentence that you didn't grasp 100%, but you'll continue ahead without interrupting the flow. Both have their advantages. Extensive reading helps you acquire the language and gain a natural feel or instinct for the language, as well as consolidating what you already know. Intensive reading, on the other hand, is good for picking up new words and learning kanji readings. The key is to try and aim for a balance between the two. There is no magic ratio. You'll have to experiment and understand what works for you. But I would recommend focusing more on intensive reading if you're at a lower level, and switch to more extensive reading as your comprehension grows. This is how you would have done it in your native language too, if you can remember back to school. But keep in mind that you'll rarely be doing pure extensive or pure intensive reading. There's a grey area in the middle that most of your reading will probably fall into, a combination of both, in other words. It's only about which side you lean towards more. There's no problem with looking up a word here and there or rereading a sentence a couple of times while you're extensive reading, and likewise, there's no issue pushing through parts you don't understand clearly or skipping unknown words during intensive reading. Intensive reading can get rather tedious sometimes, so if it becomes too boring, feel free to change it up. After all, the most important thing is to enjoy the process and not think too hard about it, to be honest. Learning vocabulary. A lot of the vocabulary you acquire will be picked up gradually and unconsciously over time during immersion, but specifically if you want to pass the test, learning the definition of words can help. Using the flashcard app Anki to make sentence flashcards for new words can be very helpful, and many people have used this with great results as an aid to their immersion. There are many other tutorials on YouTube showing you how to make sentence flashcards, so I'll spare you the details, but if you're not sure, leave a comment down below and I'll go into further detail. Some e-readers also have flashcard functions. On my Kindle, for example, any word you highlight to find the definition for automatically becomes a flashcard, which you can access anytime to review. I actually prefer this to Anki, as once you're done with the card, it never comes back, so you don't end up getting stuck with the mountain of reviews you get with Anki. Be careful, however, to limit the time you spent using flashcards. It may feel productive and give you the sense you're learning more, but in the long run, time spent with reading, listening, and being exposed to new language yields far, far better results than flashcards can ever give you. They should be used only as a supplement. When it comes to choosing what words to look up and/or memorize, it's no use spending effort to memorize rare words you'll hardly see, so I would only recommend looking up words you can recall seeing multiple times before, or at least seem somewhat familiar, even if you haven't a clue of the meaning. What I mean is, if you see a word and think, I don't know what this word means, but I feel like I've seen it or heard it before because it seems kind of familiar, that's probably a good sign to look up the definition. Conclusion. So just as a quick recap, reading ability is the most important thing to focus on if you want to pass the JLPT N1. This is because 1. The JLPT is a reading-focused test. 2. You will get a deeper and more intuitive understanding of grammar patterns and sentence structures. And 3. When you start understanding more, it becomes far more enjoyable and you improve rapidly without it ever feeling like study. However, remember not to neglect listening entirely. Also, learning the more obscure grammar points that appear on the test can be helpful, although I personally didn't do this myself. If you have any further questions or points you want me to clear up, feel free to leave a comment. And for anyone taking the test, good luck.